Now it's time to dive into taxes. Now, taxes are usually not everyone's favorite subject, but what we're going to do is we're going to analyze how taxes affect markets using our supply and demand diagram, our tools, okay? So let's look at how taxes affect markets, and we can use these tools to basically understand what's going on when taxes are levied on a product or a good or service or something like that, okay? So first we're going to talk about a few terms, and then we're going to start to go through the analysis, okay? All right, so whenever we're talking about taxes, we have to understand who's being taxed, and that's what we talk about with a tax base, right? This is the activity that is taxed, okay? So for example, if it's an income tax, then the tax base is basically workers, people earning income, okay? On the other hand, if it's, say, the taxes on cigarettes, cigarette tax, well, I'm not a smoker, so I'm not in that tax base, right? Only the people who smoke cigarettes are going to be subject to that tax, right? So this is only going to tax smokers, okay? So basically a tax is only levied on the people who are the tax base. So it'll depend on the tax who actually gets hit with the particular tax, okay? Now tax rate, this one's pretty easy. This is basically the percentage of the tax, right? So if we're talking about a sales tax, this is the tax that's levied when you go and buy something at the store and have to pay the sales tax, okay? So here in Polk County, it's basically 7%. In different parts of the country, it can be a slightly different percent, but usually it's somewhere between 7% and 9%, right? In higher tax states like California, it's a little higher. Here in Florida, depending on the county you're in, it's closer to 7%, okay? Okay, so now let's turn to our diagram, and again, I'm going to use coffee as my example product in this particular part of the lecture. So let's look at the coffee market before the tax, right? So in chapter 3, we talked about how markets work, right? And so let's start off with our market for coffee. I've got a nice supply curve drawn here and a demand curve. And so let's go ahead and label our equilibrium price and quantity. So P star, okay, and Q star. Whoops, what did I hit? There we go, come back, okay. Okay, so we've got our axes labeled, I've got price up here, I've got quantity down here. This is the market for coffee. I've got my supply curve labeled and my demand curve labeled. Okay. Now I've labeled equilibrium, so that means in this market, buyers and sellers have moved towards equilibrium. We've got a price, we've got a quantity of coffee they're buying. Everybody's happy, right? So let's think about consumer and producer surplus, okay? So consumer surplus, we know that's the value that's there to consumers that they don't have to pay for, right? And if you remember when we were going through that, it's that area that's below the demand curve. Let's grab a color. And above the price, right? So it's this triangle right here, if I can do it with this ruler that's sliding on me. All right, so this right here is CS consumer surplus, okay? All right, well, what's producer surplus? Well, producer surplus is that triangle that's above the supply curve and below the equilibrium price. That is, it's the value that's there to sellers when they get to sell something for a price that's above what they're willing to sell it for. And How do we know what they're willing to sell it for? Well, that's what a supply curve tells us, right? A supply curve is a willingness to sell line that tells us how much sellers are willing to sell at a particular price, okay? So let's go ahead and put that in. Let's go with a nice pastel green. And producer surplus is this triangle down here, okay? I'll try to do it as best I can and make it so, okay, well, it's a little wavy, but I never did that well as a kid with my coloring book. So, producer surplus down here, okay? All right, so we've done all this before. This is our market in equilibrium. This is the consumer and producer surplus before the tax. Now, I'm going through these areas because what's going to happen is we're going to have a tax implemented, and that's going to change everything. Consumer surplus is going to change, producer surplus is going to change, and we can kind of go through and see how this change happens. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. Let's go through how a tax is going to affect this market. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say there is a 70-cent tax levied on each cup of coffee sold. Okay, this is what's called a per unit tax. Okay. Now, we do this in our example rather than a percentage tax, just because a percentage tax makes the graph a little more difficult to deal with. Whereas a flat per unit tax is easy because it means there's a parallel shift of the supply curve. Okay, so we've got a 70-cent per cup of coffee tax, and it's going to be charged to the seller. That is, by law, the seller is responsible for paying this tax. All right, so let's go see how we would work through this. Okay, now if there is a tax, you have to be told on your diagram, you know, the size of the tax, right? And so that's why over here I've got a little legend that says size of the tax, and this is 70 cents, okay? All right, so we've got our supply and demand curve, and what I've done is I've actually drawn it here with my nice nifty computer so that it matches up exactly with our diagram before. So that'll allow us to kind of jump around and show how things change, okay? So same supply and demand curve, and now what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw in how the tax affects this market, okay? All right, so what I do first is I basically say, okay, who is taxed? Who is taxed? Okay, in this particular problem, it's the seller. Okay, that means I'm going to shift the supply curve. Okay, all right. So the question is, well, do I shift the supply curve to the left or to the right? Well, let's think through this. A tax is a cost that's going to be imposed on a seller, right? So if a seller has a cost imposed on them, does that lead to them producing more or less? It's going to lead to them producing less, right? If it becomes more expensive to do something, you're generally going to do less of it, okay? And so a tax is always going to cause our curves to shift to the left, right? So the supply curve is going to shift to the left. Okay, so the question is, how much to the left? Well, that's where our size of the tax over here comes into play, okay? So what you do is you basically, this is 70 cents. Now I can move this around, not that around. I can move this, oh shoot. Okay, let's delete that circle so I can move this around. I can move this around, here we go. So what you do is you basically put in a little dot that in terms of vertical distance is the size of the tax above your supply curve. So notice I've got those two dots there that both happen to be drawn so that the vertical distance between the dot and the supply curve is the size of the tax, okay? And again, this size of the tax is 70 cents, okay? All right, so why did I do that? Well, it's because I'm going to draw in a new supply curve, And I'm going to draw it right through these 2 points. Okay? And I'm going to label it with ST down here to indicate that's the supply curve after the tax. Okay? And so, okay, well, why did I draw it that way? Well, it's because, look, the tax is 70 cents. So it's going to shift our supply curve, and by how much? Well, by 70 cents, right? It's going to shift it by the size of the supply, by the size of the tax, okay? And price, that is dollars, is here on the vertical axis, right? So it's going to shift our supply curve up by 70 cents, okay? So that's why we use that little legend here to slide it around to know exactly how far we need to shift our supply curve. And now what I've done is I've created a new supply curve, the supply curve ST, that is shifted by the size of the tax. The distance between these two supply curves is always 70 cents, the size of the tax, okay? All right, so now that I've got my new supply curve, I'm going to have a new equilibrium. So let's go ahead and label that. Switch to black here. Our new equilibrium is always going to be where our new supply curve intersects our old demand curve. So let's go ahead and just label this. This is our new quantity when the tax is implemented. Okay. Let's go over here and put in our price. Okay. Now, this is the new price that the buyer pays. Okay, so price, buyer pays. Okay. All right, so this tax is implemented, shifts our supply curve up. The buyer pays this higher price for coffee now. Now, does the seller get to keep all that money? No, right? They're the ones who have to pay the tax to the government. Remember at the beginning we said who is taxed? It's the seller. So what we have to do is we have to subtract from that price that the buyer pays 70 cents. That is, we go over here, whoop, and we go down 70 cents, right? The way we constructed this diagram, this distance here that I'm highlighting with my Apple Pencil is exactly 70 cents. So I go down, and I go ahead and I label this, okay? And this is what the seller gets to keep after they pay the tax. So this is money seller keeps, keeps after tax, okay? So I label it with a P with a little subscript S there, okay? All right, so now we've got kind of our key points labeled here, okay? The tax caused the supply curve to shift to the left. We've got that in there. It raises the price to the buyer. We have that labeled. We've now show what the seller gets to keep after the tax. So now let's think back to consumer and producer surplus, okay? Well, consumer surplus is that triangle that's below the demand curve and above the price that the buyer pays. Okay, well, let's go ahead and label that. All right. Well, the area that is below the demand curve and above the price the buyer pays is right there. So this is consumer surplus, okay? Well, what about producer surplus? Well, producer surplus is that area that's above the supply curve and below the price the seller gets to keep, okay? So let's go back here. Let's go to our faithful old pastel green, and let's go ahead and draw the producer surplus in, okay? So let's go down here, go up to here. So this triangle down here is producer surplus, capital P, capital S, okay? Okay, consumer surplus is that little triangle that's below the demand curve and above the price that the buyer pays. Producer surplus is that little triangle that's down below, that's above the supply curve, but below the money that the seller gets to keep after the tax, okay? All right, now notice, compared to before the tax, consumer and producer surplus have shrunk significantly, right? Before the tax was implemented, consumer surplus was that big triangle up top, producer surplus was the other triangle down below. But now look at it, right? Consumer surplus and producer surplus have shrunk, right? So this tax is definitely going to make both buyer and seller worse off, okay? All right, well, what about, let's pick a nice blue. What about this rectangle right here? There we go. This area used to be part of consumer and producer surplus, but what is it now? Well, let's think about this. The base of this rectangle is the quantity of coffee that's consumed after the tax, and the height of this rectangle is the size of the tax. So if you multiply the tax by the quantity, you get the total tax revenue to the government. So this is tax revenue for government, okay? So this rectangle right here in the middle is always labeled as tax revenue, okay? The height is the size of the tax, and the width or the base of this rectangle is the quantity of coffee that people consume now after the tax is implemented, okay? So there's one last lonely little triangle here. Let's make this a, I don't know, let's go with yellow. Let's go ahead and put this in. There we go. Okay. This little triangle here is what we call dead weight loss. Dead weight loss, okay? Now, we abbreviate this with DWL, since we don't want to write out dead weight loss all the time, okay? All right. So, now we've kind of finished our diagram, and we've fully shown what happens when there's a tax. So, a tax is implemented. It causes the price that the buyer pays to go up. It means the money the seller gets to keep goes down. Consumer surplus and producer surplus both shrink. It generates tax revenue for the government, and it leads to deadweight loss. Now you're probably wondering what the heck is deadweight loss? Well, let me explain what that is, okay? Deadweight loss is the loss of the gains from trade that kind of go away in response to the tax, right? We say a tax or other market distortion. There's other things in a market that could lead to deadweight loss, right? But what happens is, because that tax is implemented, it means the price for the buyer goes up. If the price for the buyer goes up, it means the buyer is going to consume less, right? And so less buyers want to buy coffee, which means sellers aren't able to sell as many cups of coffee. And so there's a bunch of trade and exchange that don't take place now, right? And so that's what deadweight loss represents, right? It represents the loss of gains from trade that could have taken place if the tax was not there, okay? And this is an example. Typically in my class, I do a trading activity, but it's kind of hard to do in an online class. But in the trading activity, you would kind of visualize it as me basically levying a tax as people trade candy, right? So it would lead to less exchanges and less trade, and that's what deadweight loss represents. It represents those trades and exchanges that don't take place now because the tax has made it harder to trade and exchange.